By now you've probably figured out that biology is the study of life. And one thing that we're going to do throughout the year is when we get presented with new terminology and new words in biology is we're going to try and break them down. Most of the time we're breaking them down into their Latin roots. So if we take the word biology and we break that down into its two separate parts, the first part is bio and the second part is ology. So what are those two words? Well, bio literally translates into life, and ology literally translates into the study of. So when we look at the word biology, it literally means the study of life. Let's start off by discussing what biologists study. Let's start off with the first thing. We're going to actually break this down into four things, but the first thing we're going to look at is the interactions. So interactions of life. And I chose this picture of a gecko because I'm hoping it helps you to realize a few things here. First of all, geckos have to interact with the environment. I mean, all living organisms interact with their environment. So what things in the environment does the gecko need in order to stay alive? Well, it needs water, it needs air, it needs temperature, because reptiles can't regulate their own temperature, so they got to lay out and get heat from the sun. So it needs all those non-living parts of the environment, right? But it also needs the living parts, right? Because geckos are carnivores; they eat insects and other things, so they need to rely on nature to provide it with food in the form of other living things. So, first interaction here is the first requirement, or the first thing that we're going to study, or that biologists study, is the interactions of life. The second thing that biologists study is the diversity of life. So item number 2 here is the diversity of life. Now, I chose this picture. I have no idea what this creature is, but I chose this picture because it really, to me, jumps right out at you how no two organisms are alike. And you know, an insect is not just an insect. There's all different types of insects. So there's millions of different types of insects, and there's millions of different types of organisms on Earth. So life in of itself has this huge range of just looks and function and style. And if you think about mammals to reptiles to birds to insects, but a lot of times when we talk about life, when we talk about diversity, we focus on animals. But think about plants. Think about bacteria. Think about the little one-celled organisms that float around in the water. There's so many different styles of life. There's so much diversity to life. All right, item number 3. Biologists study the interactions of life. Now, I chose these two pictures for a reason, because let's talk about interactions right now. What we have here is an otter, and this is a keystone species, and I'm just going to write that right here. You don't need to know that right now. We'll probably talk about it more later in the year, but it makes sense. This is a keystone species. If you think about it, we're the Keystone State. A keystone is a stone we put like in an archway to keep that archway from tumbling. If you take it out, the whole thing collapses. So relate that to life here for a second. We have an otter down here, and in this first picture right here, we see our sea otter up here at the top, right up a little star by him. Or let me grab my little pen so I can point to him. Here he is. Here's our sea otter. And notice there's all these connections. The sea otters eat the sea urchins, they eat the sea stars, they eat the crabs and the fish. But what happens is if we take that guy out? What happens if we kill the sea otter, we cake him out? There's nothing to eat those higher level organisms. And the problem with that is, and this real quick explanation, look down here what the sea urchins and things eat. They eat all the kelp and all the green things and all the plant material that provides habitat. Provides habitat for the crabs and the fish. And what happens when you remove the sea otter is that there's nothing to eat the sea urchins and there's nothing to eat the sea stars. So all the habitat, the plants that provide habitat get eaten and die. And when they die, all the habitat, the places the fish and the crabs need to live, go away. And when they go away, so do the fish and the crabs. So we went from this very robust with a lot of connections and a lot of different types of organisms in this environment to this real stripped down environment where we just have some of those plankton and things that are making or photosynthesizing, and they're supporting this very limited food chain. And what we found is when we bring the sea otters back, and this actually happened, we actually killed all the sea otters in an area, and when we did, the food chain died, or the food web died, and we were left with something like this. When we bring the sea otters back, they start to eat these things again, and the plants start to grow again, and they start to provide habitat, and then the fish and the crabs start to come back. So biologists study these interactions. We need to know what's happening in our environment and how we can fix things when things go wrong. All right, so the last interaction here, item number 4, is that biologists study problems. All right, so we study problems and we propose solutions. So that's item number 4. And then if you think about it, what we just talked about with the sea otters, we studied a problem. Why did all the plant life die and the habitat die? Ooh, I just see a mistake there. Let me just make that a no. And that's because we took out the sea otters. So we take out the sea otters, the habitat dies, the fish and stuff go away. So the solution to that problem was to try and reestablish the sea otters in that area. And that's the last one for the main things that biologists study. Okay, so let's talk about the characteristics of life. We now know what biologists study, and we know that biology is the study of life. But what makes something living? And the first thing I want to point out to you is that we're going to talk about organisms a lot this year, and what makes up an organism. Now, if I say an organism, I think you probably have a pretty good idea, picture of what an organism is in your head. But the big thing I want you to realize right away is that an organism is anything that has all of the characteristics of life. And I'm going to put that here in capital letters, all of the characteristics of life. So anything with all of the characteristics of life, that's an organism. So the first characteristic we're going to talk about is that all organisms have an orderly structure. Now, what I have here is a little diagram that shows you basically, life and then those characteristics of life. So as we go across the bottom here, and this isn't exactly how we present it typically, but it says levels of organization, adaptations, reproduction, metabolism, and response. So I don't want to really focus on these. We're going to break it down into maybe a couple less categories, but let's focus right now on levels of organization. And if you look at this carefully, it's showing you levels of organization that kind of go like this. That's an arrow. So when we talk about organisms having an orderly structure, we start here. We start with atoms. And we take a bunch of atoms and we put atoms together, and that makes an individual cell. And then we take a bunch of cells and put cells together, that makes a tissue. Tissues put together make an organ. So like a bunch of tissues put together might make your liver, or a bunch of tissues put together might make your stomach. Of course, if we put different organs together, so if we could take your stomach and your small intestine and your large intestine and put them together, we get an organ system. And then when we take all the organ systems together and we look at those as a whole, we get the individual. Of course, if we take a bunch of individuals, we get a population. A bunch of populations, we get a community. A bunch of communities, we get an ecosystem. And finally, we get a whole biosphere. And we're going to talk about this part of it more later on. But right now, what I want you to realize is that life has order. It's made up of cells that make up tissues, that make up organs, that make up organ systems. The second characteristic of life, common to every living thing and every organism on Earth, is the fact that they're able to produce offspring. They're able to reproduce. They're able to bring a male and a female together and make babies, make offspring, or they simply can do it asexually. Some organisms have the ability to just divide and reproduce almost clones of themselves asexually, and we see that a lot with bacteria and things like that. So we'll talk about that more too as the year goes on. The third characteristic common to all organisms on Earth, that all organisms have to be considered living, is the ability to grow and develop. So there's a difference between growing and developing, and I just wanted to point it out quick. When something grows, like we see here, it just gets bigger over time. Developing, we'll see changes in the organism. So we'll see changes from eggs to tadpoles with legs, to young frogs, and then they'll lose their tail and become adult frogs. This is developing. This is going through changes over time. So like a caterpillar going into a moth or a butterfly, a frog going from a tadpole to a frog. This is development, where growth is just getting bigger and adding mass. So this is the third one we're talking about. And last but not least, the fourth characteristic that all organisms have to have in order to be considered living is to be able to respond to a stimulus. Now, sometimes that response might be to run away, but if you're an organism that can't move, like how does a plant respond to a stimulus? Well, maybe the plant grows in a way that it faces the sunlight. But maybe you're a little confused here because you're not really sure what a stimulus is. So you're not really sure what I mean by respond to a stimulus. Well, a stimulus, that's a stimulus. And maybe your response was to pull your headphones out. So if the stimulus is a scream, right? Me screaming, the response is to pull those headphones out. Those are the four characteristics of life. Those are the things that every organism on Earth has to have in order to be considered living. Thanks.